All right, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the most common exotics or invasive species that you can find down here in the Bosque. These are the plants that will likely take over when the cottonwood is gone. Right now in the middle of a sizable future grove of mulberries. So that's this here. There's a good chance that if you live on the east side of the city or even the west side, they're all over the place, but very common in the sort of northeast heights. You have these mulberries. They produce fruit. They're also another example of a plant like the cottonwood that is either male or female, but they're not native. They're not supposed to be here. And the thing is, the birds do love them. They produce an ample amount of food. They are pretty successful under the circumstances, under low water circumstances. And, you know, if you're the type of person that thinks that we should only have the historic ecosystem, even though climate change, dams, urban development, it's not really feasible, I'm not too upset about having mulberries around because they're a great food source for birds, and if you like to watch birds, then you might like to have mulberries around. But anyway, they have a kind of an interesting story. Back in the day, I forget exactly when, but in the 1960s, Albuquerque had a mayor, and for every new house built and every new house bought, he would give that family a mulberry tree. Now, mulberries are not native. They're not supposed to be here. They're not well adapted to this region, although they have no natural predators. So they're really good at taking over. And that little gesture of goodwill by the mayor to help, you know, give people a plant that they would eventually have in their front yard. I have one of those trees in my front yard, a really old giant mulberry. It's in front of my house that was built in 1969. So I'm living in a house that's an example of that environmental catastrophe. But anyway, the mulberry seeds flowed down into the river. They were moving slowly through the city, and they are taking over. Almost every tree I've passed by as you've been watching this has been a mulberry tree. So that's tree number one. Tree number two, which I'm approaching now, that is starting to take over this region and this habitat, is the Siberian Elm, which is this little guy here. They're all over the place. They're fairly common. Let's wait for this plane to go over. So, like the mulberry, the Siberian elm is another example of a goodwill gesture gone horribly wrong. Back in the 1930s, during the New Deal and the Great Depression, we had a sort of mayor. It wasn't really a mayor at that time, but someone whose name you've definitely heard, Clyde Tingley. Tingley Hospital, Tingley Beach, Tingley Coliseum, so on. He was sort of in charge of the city, and he was an important figure in the state. He was able to help New Mexico get a lot of money from the New Deal from the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression. But his goodwill gesture for the UNM area was to plant Siberian elm everywhere. So if you go to the UNM area, Nob Hill, in that neighborhood, there's almost every huge tree is an elm tree. And it was intended to promote the city, to bring in some greenery, to make it more Eastern-like. A lot of people who moved out here in that time didn't want to live in some, dry desert with no vegetation. They wanted something more like the East, and Tingley was from the East. I believe he came out here because his wife had tuberculosis or some thing around those lines. Anyway, he planted or facilitated and helped with the planting of all of that tree. And now that is likely to become one of the dominant trees in this area. Another significant exotic or invasive plant is this one. This is the newest one. So we have one of the oldest ones is going to be the Siberian elm, and two others that I'll talk about. But this one is called Ravina Grass. It's a Southeast Asian plant that grows somehow well here, even though it's a tropical plant, but it's taking over major sections of the Bosque. And its most likely source is the zoo. A lot of people trace back the recent spread of this plant to the zoo. That's where it may have started, that's where it may have come from and spread from. And it's all over the place, especially right by the zoo, because it's not very common north near Alameda. It's really common in the area surrounding the zoo and the biopark. So that's number three. So we have the mulberry, the Siberian Elm and the Ravina Grass. As you can see right behind me, there's quite a bit of Ravina Grass. So the last two invasives or exotics are the Russian olive, which is this one here, right behind me. Russian olive is a little less of a little more innocuous in terms of its origins, most likely planted as a result of people planting it in the yard. It's a very pretty tree. It doesn't grow super tall. It's pretty. They're another one that was planted all over the city as an ornamental, but they're also probably planted down here to control erosion because they grow well. I like them as a plant. I like their sort of multicolored leaves. They have sort of a dark green on top and a light green on the bottom. They produce flowers that smell really sweet, and they also produce food for birds. So they're another exotic that is pretty dominant down here. Where I am right now, you can see I'm surrounded by several of these exotics. We have Siberian elm, Russian olive, Ravina grass, and another one, this one here. This is known as tamarisk, or tamarix, or salt cedar. This one is pretty common and pretty problematic throughout much of the western U.S., and it has a pretty unique story as well. It's called tamarisk. It's from Central Asia, and it was brought into the Bosque area, the Rio Grande, to control erosion way back in the day when there were no cottonwoods down here, when it was just a barren wasteland of flooding and dirt. So they brought them in here to sort of simulate that, you know, what the cottonwoods did, which was hold on to soil to prevent it from causing major problems. It is a horrid plant. It is awful for many reasons. One, it uses very little water, so it's well adapted to this type of environment, and it has no natural predators. So it can spread like wildfire. It spreads like crazy. People have been spending thousands or millions of dollars over the last several decades trying to get rid of it all over the western U.S., specifically in the Colorado River system, because it sucks water like crazy. And it transpires it, puts it into the air, and takes it out of the ground, which means it takes it out of the river. Also, it kills everything around it. It does a really good job. It's called salt cedar because its leaves remove those salts from the soil that might be there and sort of concentrates them. And then that salt is dropped by the leaves into the ground, and it prevents a lot of other things from growing around it. So it creates an ecosystem that is only suitable for that specific plant, for the salt cedar. And then on top of that, it's just ugly. It's not pretty. It does have little pink flowers occasionally, but it's really just not a pretty plant. By the way, I'm looking at a spotted towhee right now. It's a good bird. I'll put a picture in. So if you want to come down to the river before 10 o'clock, and you'll see some good birds. Anyway, one interesting thing about the salt cedar, which hopefully you read about in one of your assignments bio class for the ecology unit, is that in order to eliminate this exotic species, we have introduced a new exotic species. In fact, the United States government and the western states, in order to get rid of the salt cedar, introduced its only, or one of its major predators from Asia. We brought in a beetle, the Tamarisk beetle, and introduced it to the Colorado River system, and it's killing all the salt cedar. It's doing a fantastic job. We just don't know what else it's going to do after it kills all the salt cedar. The hope is that the beetle dies off, it goes away. If its primary food source is gone, it'll stop eating, it'll die. We hope. So it's kind of an interesting situation where we have this horrible exotic species, and our only solution to getting rid of it, other than spending millions of dollars to just chop it up, is to introduce a different exotic species. Now, one thing I want to show you that's related, I guess, in order to help our native species, like the cottonwood here, grow, we have to protect it from one of its major predators, which is the beaver, which are very common down here. So you might come and find a cottonwood tree with chicken wire around its base. That's to prevent the beaver from chewing it down and getting rid of the last remnants of our ancient ecosystem. Because if you look around me right now, we've got mulberry, Russian olive, salt cedar, Siberian elm. I don't see a Ravina grass too close, but I'm sure it's around here somewhere. So anyway, that's my talk on the non-native or exotic species you have down here in the Rio Grande.